Hey guys, what's up? It's me, Thomas. Today we're back here with Extra History. Today we're checking out some U.S. history with Tuskegee Airmen. So, yeah, fly boys. I mean, I'm not sure that's the right term, but anyway, let's check them out. Be sure to like, subscribe for more. Hope you enjoy. Here we go.
Italian Theater, July 2nd, 1943. High above the countryside, Second Lieutenant Charles B. Hall steadies his P-40 Warhawk alongside a group of B-25 bombers. He and his squadron are flying escort, ensuring the big bombers aren't stung before they unleash their payloads or shot down before they can come home. Suddenly, a glint to his left. German fighters closing in high. He banks and dives away from the formation. As he thought, the German pilot in his Focke-Wulf FW-190 doesn't chase. He's locked in on the American B-25, lining up a shot on the bomber and the 10 men inside. It's a fatal mistake for the German, as Lieutenant Hall isn't running. He jams his foot pedals and yanks the stick, swerving back and around, the German sliding through his crosshairs. He jams the button.
Gotcha!
Tracers whicker in dancing streams toward the enemy. The German fighter bleeds white smoke, then drops, spiraling down toward the Italian countryside in an unrecoverable spin. It's the first aerial victory for Lieutenant Hall, for his unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and for the legendary Tuskegee Airmen.
Nice. All right.
This historical
Henson
close shave
Shaving.
is brought to you by Henson Shaving, who we thank very much for supporting this episode on important American history.
All right.
No matter where they lived in the 1940s, Black Americans experienced racism that limited their lives, goals, and expectations. So in order for an elite squadron of African-American fighter pilots to go soaring heroically into the air, you can imagine that some pertinent events needed to take place on the ground first. It starts with the Great Depression and the failing of the Herbert Hoover White House. Without that, the U.S. probably wouldn't have elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt in a landslide. Now, while the Great Depression was a catalyst for sure, FDR's win was also partially attributed to his ability to court African-American voters. Up until that point, blacks seldomly parted with the Republicans, still considered by many to be the party of Lincoln. Yet, voters who cared about the country's civil rights progress at the time had begun to feel disillusioned after years of voting Republican resulted in little change. And while he initially resisted the urge to get involved in the German conflict, FDR knew that he had to prepare the nation. So he created the CPT, or Civilian Pilot Training Program, in 1939. These aviation training programs were at universities all over the country, and many white Americans were able to sign up. Years later, Frederick Patterson, the president of the Tuskegee Institute, a college for African Americans, lobbied the War Department to authorize the creation of segregated training facilities for blacks at its airfields. Then, under pressure from FDR, the War Department agreed. It's there where these black men began their journey towards becoming aviation legends. In 1941, they received a vote of confidence from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who showed up one day to watch African-American pilots training in their Piper J-3 Cubs. After, she insisted on meeting the Civilian Pilot Training Program's instructor, C. Alfred Chief Anderson, and after an exchange of pleasantries, asked him for a favor. "I want you to take me up." Despite protests from the Secret Service, she climbed aboard, and the chief, he wasn't going to refuse the First Lady. They took off and whipped around the Alabama sunshine for around half an hour. And afterwards, she sang the chief's praises in the press, a public vote of confidence in the Tuskegee pilot's skill. Later,
honestly, if that didn't get people, like, more back behind them, I mean, heck, the First Lady was willing to let them fly. Why not? You know, racial tensions. What are you gonna do? I don't think we're even in Jim Crow are. Where did the Jim Crow laws before or after Depression? I don't know. Anyway.
That year, the Empire of Japan launched its infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, which you can learn more about in our Path to Pearl Harbor series. Then Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 4 days later. With a two-front war now firmly seated in his lap, FDR started exploring strategies to handle a global combat theater. Outrage over Pearl Harbor prompted huge numbers of Americans to enlist. And though both the American government and society had failed the black and brown men who'd returned from World War I, see our Harlem Hellfighters episode for a little on that, African-American men once again signed up in hopes of earning respect, recognition, and to serve their country. Black men came to Tuskegee from all over the country, which, given it was in Alabama, was daunting in and of itself. Many who came from the northern states were unused to the naked racism of the Jim Crow South, as opposed to the more veiled type they'd experienced in New York or Chicago. This was particularly true since in Alabama, lynching was still a regular occurrence during the war and would remain so after it. In fact, many of these young black men found themselves derided en route to Tuskegee. Yet still, they came, eager to prove that they could do the work. Some had previous flying experience, while others were just smart and talented with dreams of flight. But most knew that it wouldn't be enough to be good. They would have to excel beyond expectations, because much of the military and public expected them to fail. You see, the narrative back then was that blacks were inferior and weren't smart or mentally quick enough for complex work like aviation. In fact, many white officers, including some of the ones assigned to Tuskegee, didn't believe in the program or the recruits at all. Still, others saw the program as nothing more than a means to wash the blacks out of the military air service and shut them and their supporters up once and for all about wanting to earn wings. Many of those officers quickly trained black officers to take their positions so they could be relieved of the assignment and move on. This turned out, though, to actually be a good thing, since it brought Benjamin O. Davis Jr. to command. Davis was a West Point graduate who had endured the silent treatment from his fellow cadets most of his time there. Instead of cracking his resolve, the isolation left him more determined. He was possessed with the desire to fly, but like many black men since the First World War, he'd been rejected by the U.S. Army Air Corps because of his race. However, thanks to the establishment of the civilian pilot training program at Tuskegee, he finally had the means of achieving his goal. In fact, he'd already been assigned to teach military tactics at Tuskegee because even though he'd graduated 35th in a class of over 200, the Army didn't want him commanding white soldiers. Davis started training as an aviation cadet in the summer of 1941, part of the Institute's first class. And in less than 2 years' time, he was promoted to lieutenant commander of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the U.S. military's first all-black fighter pilot squadron. And that combat designation was a huge deal, because in much of the U.S. military, black men only filled support roles and were not provided weapons training, even on things like naval deck guns. The Army, it would seem, wanted black men driving trucks and loading cargo and not engaging the enemy. And unfortunately, Davis witnessed that play out. He saw white instructors of the 99th subject cadets to extra scrutiny, redundant testing, and in some cases being washed out for no valid reason. Often, Tuskegee trainees would be held up for as long as 14 months, when pilots from other programs would be in the air in less than 3. Yet the pace of the war and attrition rate among U.S. pilots meant that the holdup in the 99th made no sense. In fact, it was so bad that Commander Noel Parrish, one of the few white officers who treated cadets the same regardless of race, who believed in and supported the 99th, went to the War Department and called them out for dragging their feet. Parrish's only requirement was insisting the unit's training be top-notch. Finally, of sheer necessity, in 1943, the men of the 99th were deployed to Morocco. There, they joined Operation Corkscrew, a joint effort by the Allies to liberate the Axis-occupied island of Pantelleria, which was deemed essential to the upcoming invasion of Sicily. And this was where, escorting B-25 bombers, Lieutenant Hall scored the unit's first air victory that we showed you in our intro. When news got out that Tuskegee Airmen had shot down a German fighter, that downed plane was not the only thing smoking. The African-American press was on fire for Second Lieutenant Hall, who, as the first African-American to shoot down an enemy plane, was also the first to receive the Distinguished Service Cross. He also received a personal congratulations from General Eisenhower and several other high-ranking officers. Now, while the official recognition was nice, the airmen's day-to-day treatment, not so much. As successful as the unit was, they still lived in a tumble-down barracks and flew P-40 Warhawks handed down from another squadron, planes that weren't nearly as fast as the German aircraft they faced. In fact, it speaks to the skill of the 99th that they were still able to hold their own in the air. And of course, racial tensions on the ground remained. In fact, the 99th often saw their white counterparts smoking and joking with German POWs, meanwhile ignoring or insulting black flyers and ground crews. Amenities like officers' lounges and other recreational facilities were whites only, and shortly after Hall's first air victory, a group of bigoted senior officers lobbied Army Chief of Staff George Marshall to shut down the, quote, experiment of the 99th. Wow. To support their case, they submitted a 1925 Army War College report full of dubious data and stereotypes, which insisted black soldiers were too cowardly and simple-minded for anything other than manual labor. This all happened just as Benjamin O. Chief Davis was being promoted to colonel and preparing to take charge of the 332nd Fighter Group, a new, larger unit of fresh Tuskegee pilots. But when he heard that the 99th was in danger of being disbanded for incompetence, Davis had enough. He held a press conference at the Pentagon, sticking up for his unit. Then he appeared before a War Department committee to plead his case. Davis argued that the 99th, unlike white units, had no experienced veterans to guide them and were operating slower, less maneuverable aircraft than the enemy, yet they still managed to hold their own while flying against the best fighters in the Luftwaffe. Furthermore, they were flying more missions than their white counterparts. Davis's defense prompted an official inquiry that resulted in exactly the opposite of what the racists wanted. Not only did the committee find that the 99th was fighting as well as any of the white units, but during the investigation, the squadron shot down 12 more fighters over a 2-day period in January of 1944. Once that nonsense was settled, the newly formed 332nd was deployed to an airfield in Italy, where they would transition from their old P-40s to newer P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, which they decided to distinguish by painting the tails of the planes red. Thus, the codename Red Tails was born, though another nickname, the Red Tail Angels, was soon to come. As the war—
And actually, if I remember correctly, wasn't there a movie called Red Tails? I mean, I think I remember watching that one before. It was about the airmen. I don't remember what exactly, but you get the idea. So yeah. So from the slow planes to the planes that made them iconic. Anyway.
War progressed. The U.S. began taking heavy casualties as German fighters picked off their high-payload B-17 and B-24 bombers. A particularly bad situation, since the loss of each bomber also meant the loss of 10 highly trained crewmen. So, escort fighters were in high demand. And the Red Tails rose to the challenge. Their strategy, originated by Davis, was simple but strict. The job of escort flights was to escort only. The Red Tails were never to chase German fighters if they retreated, since this was a known strategy to draw away the fighter screen. The strategy worked, and the Red Tails chalked up thousands of flight miles of successful missions. They also engaged and destroyed a variety of ground targets. In fact, they were so effective that a reporter mistakenly started rumors that the Red Tails never lost a bomber during escort missions. This was untrue. They lost 27 bombers, but those numbers fell well below the average loss rate of 46 among other squadrons. And the Red Tails became so well known for their excellence in flying escort missions that bomber squadrons specifically requested the unit. This became so prevalent that Davis painted the phrase, "by request," just below his cockpit canopy. His nose art simply had 2 words, Tuskegee Airmen. Of course, there was always speculation that the bomber crews might not have known their escorts were black. Some of that speculation actually comes from oral histories with the pilots, who often said it with a chuckle. The 332nd would fly its longest mission of the war on March 24th, 1945, escorting a bomber flight to Berlin, where they were attacked by a group of 30 Me-262s, the first jet fighter. Not only did the Red Tails engage and break up the attack at long range, they bagged 3 jets, including 2 flown by German fighter aces. Originally, the Army had looked for the Tuskegee program to fail, trying to prove its stereotypes about black service members. But the opposite happened. Those men, along with their mechanics, ground crews, and nurses, served with unparalleled distinction and honor. And for a time, they achieved their goal of a double victory against fascism abroad and racism at home. They proudly served and loved a country that didn't always love them back. And while 66 of them died, many lived to see the fruits of their labor when Harry Truman finally desegregated the U.S. military on July 26, 1948. They'd also see Benjamin O. Davis Jr. named the first black general in the U.S. Air Force, and witness other milestones as younger African Americans and people from all walks of life drew from their example. It's a legacy that shouldn't be forgotten, and it should certainly never be erased, as some Defense Department articles have been around the time of this episode's airing. In February of 2025, an Air Force curriculum unit on the Tuskegee Airmen was discontinued due to the Trump administration's policies, but then quickly restored after a massive public outcry. And though these policies are atrocious, heck, we even have a series of shorts raising awareness of other examples of these deletions, it says a lot that the respect for the Tuskegee Airmen remains so high that the public would come to their defense nearly 80 years after their last combat mission. Because no matter how uncomfortable it may be at times, Black history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is every American's history. It's your history, it's my history, and we need to know it. Because truly, anyone trying to obscure that is simply doing a disservice to us all. With that in mind...
Yeah, no kidding. Like, seriously, dude. You're trying to whitewash our history now? I mean, yeesh. I mean, he was protecting the Confederate stuff, too. Like, remember, like, back when the whole Confederate statues were coming down? He was like, they're trying to erase our heritage. And yet he's doing the exact same thing with the black guys. Like, come on, dude. How overtly racist do you have to be? Like, I swear, one day we're going to learn he was a member of the KKK. We're not going to be surprised at this rate. I'm just saying. You know it's true. I mean, come on. I mean, I swear, that's going to happen at some point. Does anyone agree? Let me know in the comments. Till next time, hottie host, before I go on another rant.